In London, there's always building work going on. Something's always being put up or taken down. And sometimes we get to look underneath and we find dozens of skeletons. That's what happened both at Charterhouse Square and Liverpool Street Station in 2015. I've been thinking lately about plagues. So the year is... Look, both I and my partner have been through the ringer of the medical system in the past few weeks, so we're doing this video lying down today. But I've got flowers and lighting and stuff, I'm not an animal. So the year is 1348. This is the year the disease first arrives in London. Outbreaks tend to happen in waves. The first wave of the disease is the most virulent, with fever and spitting blood. It will kill you within 3 days at the most. Some people go to bed and never wake up again. Entire households die within a few days, which means no one finds them until weeks later. The second wave is slower but often disfigures its victims, including the famous buboes that give the bubonic plague its name. Purplish red swellings in the armpit, groin and neck that are full of blood and pus. And I suppose the scariest part is the lack of information, because no one can tell you what's happening. People are dropping like flies and no one is safe. You won't even know how many people are dying. You will hear rumours that whole cities are wiped out. The Pope's own doctor, when he's asked for his advice, the best he can come up with is go quickly, go far, return slowly. Now, when the Pope's doctor doesn't have a good answer for you, there's little wonder that people start to feel as if God has abandoned them. And to a people so steeped in Christian mythology, this is very scary indeed. If you're living in London in 1348, there is no guarantee for you that the disease won't just carry on forever and kill everyone in the whole world. At its height, 200 Londoners are dying per day. Now that's far more than the living can bury, which means people are being buried without their last rites and in unconsecrated ground, and at the plague's worst excesses, in mass graves. There aren't enough people who are healthy and alive to keep things running. Livestock die and rot in the fields because there's no one to clear away the corpses. Streets are deserted. Historians debate the exact numbers back and forth, but most people put the death toll in London for the first outbreak alone at somewhere between 50 and 60%, which is a percentage higher than both world wars put together. Think about every memorial you've ever seen in this country for the First and Second World Wars, and imagine how different our country would look if we commemorated the Black Death in the same way. It takes 150 years for London's population to return to pre-Black Death levels. Such a deep and sudden crash in population has huge echoes in the halls of history. If a plague kills a third of the peasants who work your land, you will lose a third of your rents. What do? Perhaps you will tell the remaining peasants to work twice as hard, but if the lord at the next manor is offering money to work his fields, they might break their bond of service to you and leave. If there's no one to work the land, the lord might turn it into grazing land instead. Eventually, all the well-managed fields and farmhouses will be gone, leaving a grassy hill and a deserted church. Some parts of the country become completely deserted. Most villages have abandoned houses on their outskirts after the Black Death. These are looted for any valuable timbers and eventually collapse in on themselves. Parts of churches, now too big for their parishes, are pulled down rather than repaired. Some lords sell off their estates whole rather than sink more money into them once the workers are gone. They are bought up by freeman merchants who run them like lords. And because peasants start moving around to find more work, they need surnames to distinguish them from other people with the same first name. Although surnames exist long before the plague, of course, most people in this country have no land to pass on to their children and are well known within their small communities. They don't need a second name. But suddenly, you might move to a new village, and now you need to tell each other apart. So in the same way, at the office, you'll say, which Katie? HR Katie or Ginger Katie? In the 1350s, people were saying, which John? John Carpenter or John Brown? By the end of the century, most people have a surname. Since there are fewer people to work the land, the people who are left realise that they can demand higher wages. In fact, in 1351, the king passes the Statute of Labourers, trying to enforce a maximum wage set at pre-plague levels. And peasants start to realise the inadequacy of the social order. If their priests can't protect them and their lords abandon them, why should they feed them? Faith in the church is severely dented after people realise the church can't stop the disease or help the dying. In fact, the death rate among the clergy may be even higher than average because of how close a monastic community lives. It's perhaps not a coincidence that 40 years later we have the huge popular uprising of the Peasants' Revolt and the first big dissenting religious movement in England, the Lollards, led by John Wycliffe. Xenophobia heightens as people become suspicious of sailors bringing in foreign diseases. Many outsider groups are blamed, particularly Jews. In some places in Europe, thousands of Jews are tortured and murdered. And that's just the first outbreak. You can get it again. It comes back in 1361 and 1368 and 1375, and it keeps coming back for about 300 years until the very last major outbreak in this country, which is 1665. In the very last month of 1664, 2 French sailors are found dead in a gutter near Drury Lane Theatre. A week later, the woman who found them, Mrs. Annie Clackett, is dead, and a week after that, the government official who examined Clackett's body is dead. But no one wants to call it plague yet. Because although in 1665 we don't know what causes the plague or how it spreads, we do know one measure to slow the spread, and that is quarantine. In April, an area called St Giles in the Fields near Covent Garden gets its first recorded case, and as a quarantine measure, officials board up the house with the inhabitants inside. Plague-stricken houses must be shut up for 40 days. Victims are shut in their houses and a red cross painted on the door with the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." Armed guards are placed at the door. You need to pay the watchman to bring you food. If you can't pay, the starvation might get you, even if the plague doesn't. The neighbours see this as terribly unjust and break the padlock, letting the inhabitants out. 3,000 people in St Giles die of the plague. Because of strict quarantine rules, you might not want to admit your Auntie May died of the plague. You might want to pretend it was something else. There are old women, usually very poor, called searchers of the dead, whose job it is to examine bodies and report cases of the plague. They're paid 4p for every plague victim they find, but they are easily bribed. If you can get out of the city by any means, you do. The rich flee to their country homes. Ordinary people camp out on boats to avoid the plague, closing up the river from Wapping almost all the way out to the sea. Schools, theatres and the courts all close. But you might not be able to afford to close your business until the plague is over. You might struggle to make enough money to eat. With no one to bury them, coffins pile up in the streets. If you have any medical training, you will learn that the plague is spread by miasma, bad air. And this isn't a totally stupid idea. A lot of things that smell bad will make you sick. And we know today that there are diseases that spread through the air. To visit your patients in safety, you might don this outfit, which is now famous as a plague doctor outfit. The long beak of the mask contains sweet-smelling herbs to ward off the miasma. This certainly isn't a uniform, and it may be that only a few physicians actually wear it, but it's certainly associated with doctors visiting plague houses. The outfit might seem superstitious, but the robes are waxed, and coupled with the mask, hat, and gloves, they do offer protection against flea bites. If you find yourself in 1665, probably one of the best things you can do with the available technology is get yourself a plague doctor outfit. Ordinary people try and ward off miasmas in other ways, by taking up smoking, by carrying a capsule full of sweet-smelling ingredients called a pomander, or by lighting bonfires on street corners. These are less helpful. In London, 100,000 people die, a fifth of the population. For context, as of August 2021, about 15,000 Londoners have died of COVID, out of a population of 9 million, a smaller percentage of a much larger population. This is not to diminish the scale of the COVID pandemic. Obviously, something doesn't have to be as bad as the literal Black Death in order to be bad, but it's to give you a sense of the scale of the destruction. London is so quiet that in some places grass starts to grow in the street, and deer are seen walking around for the first time in centuries. After this, the plague fizzles out in London. Some people will tell you that this is because the Great Fire in 1666 killed all the rats that spread the plague, which is one of those myths that if you think about it for a few minutes, you'll realise can't be true. A plague that's happening all over the country can't be stopped by a fire in one city, no matter how devastating the fire is. And besides, the death toll was already on the way down by the time the fire happened. The last recorded plague death in London was in Rotherhithe in the 1670s, and the last big outbreak in Europe was in 1720 in Marseille, in which 50,000 people died. To this day, we don't know exactly why it just stopped. Theories include increasing pest control in cities, the black rats which carry the flea that spreads the plague being supplanted by brown rats which have different fleas, changes in climate, and the effectiveness of quarantines. But it does still exist. In the 1890s, there was another plague pandemic which started in Southeast Asia and spread across the world to Africa, Australia, and for the first time, America. This time, with increased understanding of germ theory, scientists were able to study it and learn a lot more about it. Now we know it's a bacterial disease. It's mostly passed by flea bites, from a flea that lives on rodents like chipmunks, gerbils, prairie dogs, and in Europe, black rats. These days it can be treated with antibiotics. So to return to those plague pits in London. Normally when you find a skeleton on its own, you can't actually tell that it personally died of the plague. The plague kills you too quickly to mark your bones. What you can say is that if you find a whole heap of hastily buried skeletons dating from a plague year, you can say you've found a plague pit, but that doesn't necessarily prove that any one person in there had the plague. Maybe they just happened to have died of something unrelated at the same time. But recently, technology for finding ancient DNA has improved, and on these skeletons from Charterhouse Square, they found traces of the DNA of the plague bacterium. Still there, 700 years later.